And next we will hear from Ms. Samar, who is the Executive Director of a Research Accelerator at the University of Chicago. She will be arguing for the merits of engagement. To begin, I want to say that I don't even think it's a question that we all care about the plight of the Palestinian people. And as a caveat, I want to be clear, although I'm using a religious story, by no means am I implying that there is one Islamic approach, but there is one correct strategy. Imagine the scene. A year after the pivotal Battle of Badr, the Quraysh fight and defeat the Muslims in the Battle of Uhud. The Muslims are knocked down and feeling weak. So what do the Quraysh do? What any smart opponent does when his enemy is feeling down. They prep for a complete and utter takedown. They pull together the largest army in the history of the Arabian Peninsula to finally wipe out the Muslims once and for all. The Prophet, peace be upon him, summoned his followers to a consultation to gather their ideas and strategies. One of the non-Arab Sahabas, a Persian, Salman al-Farsi, stood up and suggested a non-conventional strategy that involved digging trenches. Now, what's important to know about Salman al-Farsi is that he was a figure who had embedded himself in many different faith traditions prior to coming to Islam, meaning he had been exposed to lots of different ideas and modes of thinking. Salman al-Farsi was a disruptor far before that term even existed. This strategy was radical in a culture where norms of engagement and tradition were almost sacrosanct. This crossed the boundaries of what was acceptable. This was different. This was risk-taking. Why is it significant that the Prophet and his companions agreed to embark upon a very radical strategy that was suggested by a non-Arab? It's significant because they were not wed to any particular strategy. Rather, their goal was to survive. The Prophet realized that his existing strategies weren't working fast enough and in the way that was needed. He understood startup culture buzzwords far before his time. They practiced the mantra, iterate or die, to its most literal meaning. So what does this story tell us about our own decision-making when it comes to the complex problems we face, whether it's CVE, White House iftars, and yes, even MLI? It tells us that not only is listening to people who are unlike us an act of generosity and a path to discovery, but if we want people to listen to us, we have to be willing to engage. The Prophet understood this. On the contrary, what happens when we make a particular strategy like boycott holy and untouchable, even when its current successes are questionable and random at best? What happens when boycott itself becomes our goal and no one else can try anything? We end up maligning, smearing, and outgrouping our own people and allies. What happens is where we are today. Every moment someone is boycotting an MLI participant and getting enraged about White House iftars is a moment they're not spending actually doing the work and making a difference in the lives of people who are suffering. Yes, you can boycott the White House iftar, but does anyone even care? Tweeting your disappointment in and insulting our own people is not the work. Changing lives in real and measured ways is. We could wait 100 years for a boycott against MLI to actually and directly end the suffering of Palestinian people. But when lives are on the line and the environment is rapidly changing, why aren't we willing to make room for other approaches as well? Which gets to what might be my most important point. Why engage with the very people who condone oppressive policies? Why does engaging with people who don't think like us matter so much? With rising Jewish criticism of the occupation and the recent nuclear accord between the Obama administration and Iran, it's more than obvious that there are significant fissures within the American Jewish community. Why are we not reflecting on these rapid global changes? Why are we shooting ourselves in the foot by only applying strategies that were effective in a world and a political context that no longer exists? If I had time, I would tell you another story about the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. I'm going to trust that you remember some of your Sunday school lessons and gloss over the details today. As a brief reminder, in this story, the Prophet, to the dismay of his most trusted companions, signed a 10-year peace treaty that included what some of the companions felt were humiliating concessions to Quraysh. In fact, some of the companions complained, why are we even at the table with people who have been persecuting us for decades? In the end, what looked to be a humiliating compromise actually turned out to be a massive victory because the purview of the Muslims was now the entire Arabian Peninsula and not just Mecca. Further, engaging with the Quraysh meant that the Muslims were now recognized as an actual entity and not just a renegade population. This recognition by his adversary mattered to the Prophet. That recognition allowed him to introduce himself and Islam to other world leaders, to other people who would listen. Even more striking, the Prophet was instructed in the Quran that if your enemy is seeking peace, even if you think it's a ploy, you have to work towards peace. Another mistake we often make is to rely too heavily on the rationality of those who disagree with us. People are not purely rational. People adhere to oppressive cultural practices not out of rationality, but because of culture and tradition. What's happening today in Israel is a perfect example of this. On its own, BDS doesn't challenge why so many Israelis support policies that are oppressive and violate human rights. There is something beyond the rational there. There's something beyond utility. And so if you're trying to replace what is pathological in an ideology, you can't just do that with boycotts or by relaying information to our own echo chambers. You also need to change the morality of the people who think this way, and to do that, you have to start with relationships. I'm going to end with another story. The optimism of one person matters and can change the world. Nelson Mandela did. Through 27 years of incarceration, he saw the meaning of suffering. Yes, BDS was essential to that movement. But Nelson Mandela also had a deep willingness to engage with his enemy. And because of that, he changed the mindsets of 90% of the people who had once condoned a racist ideology. He changed the entire moral code of a people. That is why he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Here's the thing. We can't solve our most complex global problems without the people who see the world differently than us. These are people who are not like us, but people who are completely like us.